Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. Muy buenos días también si nos están viendo desde Aviala. Bienvenidas a esta sesión que hemos denominado, que hemos querido bautizar como Furia Puta. Esta es la mesa en idioma castellano, idioma español, que por parte que ha diseñado conjunto con Sombrillas Latinas, por parte de ICRC, el Comité Internacional por la defensa de los derechos de las trabajadoras sexuales en Europa. Mi nombre es Sabrina Sánchez, yo soy codirectora de la Junta de ICRC y también soy cofundadora del sindicato OTRAS de España, soy miembro también de APROSEX España, tenemos dos compañeras nos acompañan de ambas organizaciones, y soy trabajadora sexual en activo y voy a ser vuestra moderadora, vuestra host esta tarde que tenemos de Furia Puta. ¿Por qué Furia Puta? ¿Por qué hemos decidido ponerle así? Es un evento básicamente en inglés, por lo que el hecho de que tuviéramos un título en castellano, digamos, y que se pudiera entender en muchos idiomas, bueno, daba a entender precisamente eso, ¿no? De lo que vamos a hablar hoy 11 de diciembre, que justamente estamos a 6 días de conmemorar esta fecha del 17, que es el día en contra de las violencias hacia las trabajadoras sexuales. Y bueno, precisamente esta Furia Puta viene de todas esas violencias, ¿no? De esas violencias que hemos vivido siempre las trabajadoras sexuales, con esta falta de derechos laborales que tenemos, con este estatus de marginación en el que siempre nos han puesto esta sociedad bien pensante, y que bueno, este año, en el 2020, se han visto acrecentadas con la pandemia del COVID. Toda esta falta de derechos que hemos venido denunciando, todos estos derechos por los que hemos venido peleando, de haberlos tenido antes, de ser ya sujetas de esos derechos, bueno, quizás no estaríamos padeciendo todas las injusticias, toda la violencia y todas las pérdidas que estamos padeciendo en este 2020 por esta pandemia. Una vez dicho esto, me gustaría presentar a las panelistas.
Having said that, I would like to introduce our panelists, and they'll tell you a little bit about themselves and the work that they do. So first of all, we have Linda Por, and she's an archivist. She's a sex worker whore archivist, puta, and Linda is currently teaching courses about issues to do with sex work, and she also does a lot of great work to help promote sex workers' rights, and she's currently based in Spain, where she's been living for 20 years. So we also have our comrade Conxa. She's the Secretary General of OTRAS, which is the first sex worker-led trade union in Spain. It's the first registered sex workers union in Spain. And so she's also going to be sharing insights with us. And we have Juan Florian. He's a great sex workers activist as well, and from the STRASS workers union. He advocates for the rights of people living with HIV, and he's based in Paris, so there's a lot to speak about in terms of the situation there, and he will be giving us an overview of the situation there. And our next panelist is Agustina Quaranta, a trans sex worker and member of COSMOPOLITRANS, which is a sex workers' rights organization. They are organizing in Germany and in different cities in Germany. They're really doing impressive work with all of our trans colleagues and comrades. And they were having housing difficulties before COVID, and of course COVID has made everything even worse. And so Agustina is really going to be giving us a lot of interesting details, and we're excited to hear the information she has to share with us. And so we're also we're waiting for Georgina Orellano to join. We're hoping she'll join soon. She's based in Argentina, and she's going to be speaking to us about how the situation for sex workers is in Argentina. So that's all for me for now. I am giving the floor to my combabe, Linda Porn. Linda, please start. Thank you so much. Thank you for all our comrades and colleagues here. And I think it's a great idea to be able to have a roundtable in Spanish. And something I'd like to show everyone here is this book, Putas Migras, or Migrant Whores. It's one of the first books of its kind that's been written in Spanish. And it's the story of 3 migrant sex workers. And it's about their experience with sex work and being migrants. So talking about the 17th of December, which is the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, we're going to be focusing on the negative consequences that abolitionism has had on us as sex workers. I'm going to cover some points that I'm sure you're already familiar with, but I would really like to put an emphasis on the different issues of race and class that intersect with the problems that we face. I'd also like to mention the Nordic model. The Nordic model only contributes to more marginalization and isolation of sex workers. Why is the Nordic model so bad and so harmful to us? It's directly advocating for the regulation and restriction of adults' sex lives. So since it was first established in some countries, the fines that are given for people who engage in sex work, a lot of things. This makes things much more difficult for us to carry out our work. So what it's trying to do is control sexual relations between 2 consenting adults. And so it was first seen in, it was introduced by the Swedish government in 2005. And it's very classist. It contributes to persecution against sex workers, especially sex workers who work in the streets. And some of the laws associated with it have been used to accuse sex workers of trafficking and also of loitering and other associated violations and crimes. And honestly, it's a very fascist policy because it's trying to control the lives of individuals and the choices of individuals and stripping them of their agency. And so it's saying that essentially the conclusion of it is that people who don't adapt to certain norms, they're kind of isolated from society and are liable to face legal consequences. And it's trying to control the general population. Sometimes it gets to such extremes that sometimes people who are over 18 are stripped of their rights because they can be penalized by the state for engaging in so-called self-destructive acts. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a break away from these heteronormative and restrictive norms that society imposes on us. So laws that are geared at protecting youths and aimed at trying to safeguard their rights and make sure that they have access to health services and equal rights. Supposedly, this is what the model is trying to do, but it doesn't really do, because it's actually a very punitive approach. It also really affects prostitution or sex work, especially for people who are over 18 years old, because it can apply to people up to 21 years old. And so these are people who are of age, and they're adults, and they can make their own choices. Abolitionism is also a classist model. It's imposed on us by, it's a very Western model. It's based in Judeo-Christian values, and it's never actually integrated or accepted expressions of sexuality. It tends to divide everything into either art or not art. According to the Swedish law, they looked at different images, and they're declaring some things pornography and other things not. So this is honestly classism, because only people who are trained in theater, for example, or people who have artistic education are the ones who can get away with like actors, for example, theater actors. They're the only ones who can engage in what's essentially sex work, but it's classed as art, whereas sex workers are not excluded from this, and their work is not viewed as art. So it's something classist, because there are certain professions that have exceptions, and they're the people who tend to be privileged or have access to certain education in very specific and societally condoned fields. And so abolitionism is classist. That was my main point there. So the Swedish law that was passed in 2005 also had to do with migrants and foreign workers who came in. People who came from abroad and asked for permanent residency could be denied this permanent residency if they were even suspected of committing a crime, or for having used what's called dishonest methods during their time in Sweden. And of course, this was actually referring to sex work. And the border that they have there is actually one of the hardest ones to cross, or to get into the country in all of Europe. And so there was this idea of these people have, a premeditated means to commit a crime. And what actually ends up happening is that the people who are generally criminalized under this law are people who are not white, or people who are not Christian, or in other words, people who do not fit in with societal norms and aren't in the privileged class. So these are honestly systems and laws that trace their roots back to colonization and colonialism, and they negatively affect the well-being and livelihood of sex workers. So it's been very significant what's happened in Sweden. There's been a lot of reports and not very many cases that are actually seen through to the end. It seems silly to their defense is that they're combating human trafficking, but Sweden has never actually had a very severe trafficking problem. What's actually ended up happening is that sex workers are being criminalized and accused of trafficking when they're engaging in legitimate work. And prostitution is being completely equated with human trafficking. So in council reports and studies, they're able to use this term of trafficking, and it's used to help oppress foreign women. That's what we're trying to say here, is that what the Swedish government has done in their attempts to combat trafficking, they've really criminalized our communities. And it's actually they're financing radical feminism. And what's happening is that the most persecuted populations are the ones that are being criminalized and targeted. For example, migrant women. Society at large views migrant women as a scourge on their society. They see them as illiterate, uneducated, and there's often this narrative of them being trafficking victims that need to be saved. And they even try to focus on figures that allow this model to continue existing, because if they didn't have figures that they could point to saying that we have all these victims, they wouldn't be able to continue imposing this Nordic model. So oftentimes fully consenting sex workers are framed as either trafficking victims or even perpetrators of trafficking. So as a result of this, there's more poverty and also more of a sense of secrecy and having to work underground. So this decision that was made by the Council for Health and Well-being is really just, we've described it as a punch in the air. We can see that this law is actually extremely patriarchal, and it has its roots in colonialism, where the clients are soliciting services, and we're actually making sex workers invisible with this law. And sex workers are excluded, we're not validated, and as a result, we're much more liable to suffer from poverty, stigma, violence, and sex workers being illegitimized and forced underground. And this forces sex workers to lower their prices and also engage in more risky behavior in order to be able to continue working. Thank you so much, Linda. And that's been a really great overview of how things are here in Europe. And the countries are trying to follow the example of Sweden, which has been failing now for almost 20 years. And it's all coming down from the high level organizations like the European Union, etc., and it's trickling down. And yes, we're seeing it now in Spain as well. There's this trickle down effect. Yeah, they're taking everything and just copying and pasting it over and applying it to their countries as well. And so this is going to be a bit of an explosive session because we really want to express the rage that we feel. Next, we're going to be hearing from Conxa, and they're going to be telling us about the situation, how the situation in Spain and how sex workers have been affected by the pandemic. And we're also going to reflect a bit on all the progress that we've made and all the steps that we've taken to come together as a community of sex workers. So Conxa, it's your turn. You're on mute.
¿Cuánto tiempo tengo, Sabrina? 9. Ok. Así me voy distribuyendo.
Okay, can everyone see me, I think? Good morning, good afternoon to everyone here. So 17th of December is a day that is nothing to celebrate. And it's the day that we can say that this year, we'd like to be able to say that the cycle of violence against sex workers has ended, but it's not going to be in 2020. 2020 has been bad for sex workers. It's been bad for the world in general, but especially sex workers. So where do I even begin? A trade union is not a space where, I mean, I don't even know how to cover all of the work that we've been doing in Spain since February. when we started the union, we wanted to work on other issues, but given the context, we've come together and we've been able to organize to raise money for and funds for our colleagues who most needed it. And that's what we do as a union, and what the purpose of a union is to fight for labor rights and the rights of workers. And in our union, what we're doing is fighting for the rights of sex workers. So honestly, the sad reality is that 2020 has not been good for us, and it may be a bit pessimistic of me, but I do not think that 2021 is going to be much better. I would like to congratulate the people who have taken the initiative to organize this roundtable, because I think it's extremely important for organizations around the world to be a lot more in contact with each other than what we usually are. Because I think, you know, we are in contact, but I think we can be even more in contact and communicate even more. And it's because our struggle, our fight, it's something we need to be very united. We really need to work together and cooperate to achieve our goals. And while it's true, I think that we really need it's true that we do have links already, but I really think we can put in the effort to create even more and work together on campaigns. Because these are issues, we're facing the same sorts of issues in countries around the world. In Spain, we're now facing laws that are following the example of the Swedish model. And Spain has taken pride in being the second in doing everything like this. So we are, they're essentially like the second Sweden in this sense. And that means that our colleagues who work in the streets are facing fines, but also we're seeing something extremely serious with these continuing laws that are being implemented. These really, this is not good news at all. We're seeing the situation continue to worsen. Things are worsening in Argentina as well. Our colleague Georgina is hopefully joining us in a bit, and she'll be able to tell us a bit more about the situation in Argentina specifically. And we're honestly currently in a time where I really think we need to join forces, and we need to be in a lot more communication with each other, and policies need to be developed from a much more international point of view, rather than a perspective that's very limited to our different regions. We're fed up of our colleagues not even be able to have a bank account, because as soon as they have a bank account, their money and income is being monitored, and they receive a ton of fines just for having been in the streets. We're seeing trans women are especially marginalized in this sense, and they face even more stigma. And sometimes we're asked for bribes or to give free services to the police, for example. So, as I was saying before, in APROSEX, in the union, we're really fighting to promote sex workers' rights. When we started, we had no idea where to begin. It's been almost an insurmountable seeming task, but we've really achieved a lot of progress. So I'm really happy with the success of our project. We've really been able to help a lot of our colleagues. We put a lot of love, dedication, and affection into helping our comrades and colleagues, because we're all sex workers, and I think we need to break away from the groups that are trying to strip us of our agency and really tell us what we can do with our lives, or that are trying to get us involved with social services, which are often just a trick to try and get us out of sex work. I would like to mention that our first campaign was in March and April, and we raised 13,000 euros, which were distributed amongst sex workers in Spain. And we distributed to different women's organizations and sex workers organizations. We also had a fundraising event on the 9th of September, and there we also raised several thousand euros, which were distributed amongst our colleagues. And so what this means is that we are the funds were not distributed in an arbitrary manner. Rather, the way that we chose the different organizations is they told us, we need this much money for this many people. And we prioritized those who, the women, the people, the families who really needed the support. But we were always doing this from a very neutral perspective, from a very objective perspective. Because we think it's extremely important that this sort of financial assistance remains completely accessible and egalitarian. And I think we've shown that, yes, it is possible to do things differently and perhaps even better. Thank you. Thank you, Concha. It's been very interesting what you shared with us about the situation in Spain. Because here we're also seeing the same political trends where the government is continuing to marginalize and oppress sex workers. And we're really pissed off about it, because we're being objectified and marginalized, and we're being subjected to discrimination. And they're agendas that really don't they don't protect us, they don't serve us, they don't help our well-being, and these laws are extremely harmful to us, and they make things more difficult for us. They make the situation more complicated, and it's something that we're seeing all over the world. Now we're going to be moving to Paris and hearing a bit from Juan Florian. Yes, yeah. Okay. So I agree with Linda and Concha. The 17th of December there's nothing to celebrate. There is a lot to call out. We are furious. We're so pissed off. And that's why the title of today is Horror Fury, or Horror Rage. Because really, what does the day mean? We're commemorating the lives of colleagues and comrades who have died, who have been murdered. And that's why we're so fucking angry. Like Concha said, the 17th of December, one day it's going to be a day when we can celebrate the end of violence against sex workers. But that day is not going to happen this year, because we're still facing a lot of injustice. And we're in a really bad situation, and it's gotten even worse this year. Here in Paris, we've been completely decimated. We've seen a lot of bloodshed, a lot of violence in our communities, a lot of investigations against us, a lot of hatred and distrust of sex workers, also transphobia, and all of these police investigations were unfounded. They didn't have any idea. And we're asking, why are we being killed? We're being killed because we're whores. That's the only answer that we have. And imagine the situation in France right now. And they've also copied the Swedish or the Nordic model since the 16th of April. And they think it's the vanguard, and it's so progressive to criminalize clients. Before, France used to criminalize sex workers. And so basically, they thought that it would be very progressive to label sex workers as victims. And they're always, like, as always, they're trying to find a bad guy or a criminal in the field of sex work. So they've decided to switch the blame from the whores to the clients. And that's not the worst thing, that the clients are being criminalized. The worst part is when sex workers are being criminalized because they're seen as part of the trafficking system, or they're even being framed as pimps. And a lot of times the police will stop sex workers, and they're suspecting them of being of pimping. If we decide to come together, to work together, to create a network, a support group, a support network, we are criminalized because what we're doing is that supposedly we're helping to perpetuate this system of trafficking. So what we're really the victims of is a system that does not recognize our work, and instead it criminalizes it. And it forces us into this position where we're very vulnerable, and our situation is extremely precarious. So it's important to know that in France currently, we have the Nordic model that we're seeing in Sweden, in Norway, now in France as well. And the authorities have this very closed-minded view of things. And we're seeing so much proof of violence against us, of how we're being victimized, and the police don't care about that. The only thing that they care about is criminalizing sex work. And the rights of sex workers as workers are being completely ignored. And now we're in an even more precarious situation, because, like I said, we're not able to organize. And if we organize as sex workers, the punishments are quite severe. That's why we're furious. We're full of rage. This puta rabia puta. And we do celebrate our coming together, and the fact that we have been able to continue helping each other, and we're seeing how we're continuing to support each other. And we want the authorities to really understand that sex work is work, and we're not perpetuating trafficking, because yes, sex trafficking does exist, but that's different. We're against that, of course. We're against any form of violence. But sex workers who consent to offering services are not victims of trafficking. we're workers, just like any other form of worker. Any worker who uses their mind in their work, or their hands, or their mouths, for example, their voice. Sex work is also work. It's legitimate work. And for that reason, we deserve access to the same rights that workers around the world have, that all workers have. And we're not contributing to trafficking. We're completely against trafficking. And as a result of these laws that are aimed at reducing trafficking, we have ended up in a much more precarious situation. And what these laws are also doing is they're not only criminalizing sex work, they're criminalizing migration as well, and migrants. And we're seeing so many horrible effects in our community, not just as a result of HIV now, but now with COVID as well. Sex workers are often the most affected. Who's going to see a client with a mask on? That's what we're the first group, the first people that the police are coming to check out. We're the first ones who are being checked up on to make sure that we're complying with lockdown. And there's been colleagues who are criminalized just for not carrying their passports by the police. And so what's ended up happening is that our organizations, the community grassroots organizations, have ended up having to take on the work that really should be being done by the government to support our colleagues and fellow sex workers. So the government really should be taking on this responsibility, because they are the ones who are responsible for ensuring the safety and rights to health and well-being of sex workers and of everybody. This is the responsibility of the state, and they're not fulfilling this responsibility. We're having to do it. That's why we're so fucking pissed off. We're so mad about this. And so on the 17th of December, we're going to be commemorating even more victims. And there's still more victims. There's always more victims. And the authorities of countries in the world need to recognize that sex work is work, and we deserve rights. We are people just like everyone else, and we deserve our rights. That was great. Thank you. I completely agree with you. I really have nothing to add to that. We're always there in the middle, in the eye of the hurricane, and everything that's going on in France as well with COVID too. On the 13th of March, we had that abolitionist writing in the media saying that we were calling it the abolitionism virus, because it was like they're using it as an excuse to do away with prostitution, and they're saying like, oh, like all these whores are living off of the state, they're wanting a universal basic income. That it's something, it's very problematic, because the abolitionists are pushing this rhetoric, and no one's ever listening to us as sex workers. And of course, these abolitionist organizations have loads of resources. They have all these connections in the government, for example, and other people in position of power. And a lot of the time they have connections with the churches as well, and religious institutions, and they're receiving millions of euros every year from governments, from the Spanish government, for example, from other organizations, and they're comfortable at home. And well, on the other hand, we're doing everything we can just to survive. We're working in the streets, and especially trans women, and that's where we always see a lack of support, a lack of rights, and this is a problem that we've been seeing for many decades now. And our trans colleagues in Germany, we're going to hear from Agustina now, and they live, they're Argentinian, but they live in Germany, and we're going to hear a little bit about how the situation is in Germany. And so, Agustina, your turn. Hi, thank you. So first of all, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much. And I'd like to say that it's great that this session is in Spanish, because I think that's very important as well. Here in Germany, we do have a Latina community, and I think one of the biggest problems that we have here in Germany is it's very difficult for us with the language here. It takes us a long time to learn the language here. And so, and of course, communication is an essential skill that we, it's something that we definitely need to be able to move forward. So I really appreciate that this session is being hosted in Spanish. So the first thing I'd like to say, everyone thinks that in Germany, they're legalizing sex work, but actually, the situation isn't quite like that, because we have different levels of criminalization. There's different kinds of work, different kinds of income levels. For example, there's people who work in brothels here where you have to pay a very high price to work there. It's like a daily rent or house fee. And there's also the taxes. And you don't actually go home, you're not left with a lot of money at the end of the day. And in the windows, the situation is similar for the people who work in the windows, because recently, there's a lot more regulations that they have certain hours that they're allowed to work. Like, for example, you're allowed to work until midnight or until 1 a.m. And a lot of girls only manage to make the money that they have to pay to work in the first place, and they don't go home with anything. So when people say like, oh, well, it's legal in Germany, like things are great for sex workers there, it's actually not so great. On top of that, in order to work in Germany, there's a lot of requirements. One of them is called an amendum, and it's basically like that you're registered to live there, or registered as a resident. And there's other laws that are required in Germany. For example, you need a financial number, or like a tax identification number of sorts. So you need to go to register with someone for that as well. So what's going on here in Germany? So yes, prostitution has been recognized as a form of work since 2002. And what that's left us with is, if you are not formally registered, you're not able to work. And honestly, sex workers face a lot of difficulties in Germany. And those who do not strictly follow the process that they have in order to for people to access their pension, so to call it, because here you have the residency requirement that you need to sign up there, and really depending on the region that you work in, there's different people running things that you need to comply with. And for example, if your papers are taking a while to be processed, and that's happened to a lot of colleagues in recent years. Sometimes they take a really long time, or there's some sort of mistake that they're not accepted, and so then what they'll do is they'll go to the authorities, and then they're sent to places where supposedly they're going to help you, but and in the meantime, you're being fined just for working. And this is something that really affects people, and especially the people who are really having to struggle to work to take care of their families, to pay their rent. All of the sex workers in Germany are required to pay for medical insurance. Medical insurance here is not free, it's not universal, and it is a requirement, and that's something that we also have to pay for. And that's on top of everything you have to pay in order to, for all of the processes and paperwork to even be able to work here legally. So sometimes, at the end of the day, someone who works, who charges each client 50 euros, she's going to have to see so many clients just to make the amount she needs even to be able to survive. So it's not as simple as saying that sex work is legalized here. It's a little bit difficult to compare the situation here with the situation in Spain or France, for example, where they're still fighting to legalize sex work. But I have to tell you that it has its pros and cons. It's really not as simple or as easy as it sounds. So COSMOPOLITRANS, which I found was founded in conjunction with my colleague Maria. The idea behind it is we really wanted to support each other. We met each other in the course of our work. We wanted to create a project, and we work on different campaigns, audiovisual materials, for example. And then in March, with the pandemic and everything, we had to completely change our strategy at COSMOPOLITRANS and divert all of our efforts and funding into supporting sex workers. Because there's 3 different levels of sex work here. Some people are completely legal. They have their whore pass, as it's called. Then you have the health insurance that you have to renew in some places every 6 months and in some places every year. And then you also have the financial or the tax requirements. So if you do not fit all 3 of these, if you've not complied with all 3 of these, you are not legally protected. So when the pandemic started, Germany did give funding to the self-employed, but what happened was that due to their situation, a lot of the girls who were working, especially trans women, were not properly registered or legally registered, and for that reason, we were not eligible for the assistance from the government. If you are not registered, you cannot access the support and assistance. In Germany, you cannot open a bank account unless you have a registered address or domicile. So it's extremely difficult for the girls who work in brothels to be able to have legal status as workers. So that's something that we really had to work to address since the pandemic started. And we've been working with open foundations to be able to generate income, to be able to feed, and to respond to the needs of our colleagues who were left completely destitute, to put it that way. A lot of girls are working in the streets in other countries. Here in Germany, a lot of people work nomadically almost. There's a lot of trans sex workers who move from city to city. And sometimes they were not even allowed to work in the brothels, and they aren't given food or anything like this. Other girls were not even able to take shelter in brothels like some people were, and they had to work out of hotels. I have a friend who contracted COVID and died, a trans girl. Also, other colleagues. It's honestly really uncomfortable to talk about because it's very embarrassing for some of us. We're self-employed workers. We are used to having money and to being independent and being able to take care of ourselves. So it's very difficult to have to ask for help when you're not okay. So a lot of our colleagues had to go out into the streets to look for work. And keep in mind that the temperature is below 0 degrees a lot of the time. And so they're having to face all of these horrible conditions, as well as the police and being afraid of the police because they can be fined 500 euros. So honestly, if it's so legal, why am I being treated like I'm doing something illegal? So it's quite difficult when people say like, well, everything, it's legal, and so things are easier for you. But I have to say like, no, it's really not. It's not as easy as it sounds. It's not, everything's not okay. And the girls who come here to work find out that it's not as easy as it sounds. And the situation's not as good as it sounds. And so my colleague, the co-founder of COSMOPOLITRANS, has done a great amount of work in June and July. We were supplying sex workers with basic food products and basic supplies. And then our colleagues started having problems with finances. And so once again, we were providing them with financial support. And our colleagues look for they look to the government for assistance, but a lot of the times it doesn't come, and it's really because we're prostitutes, because we're sex workers. We're still discriminated. We're still discriminated against. Sex work is still criminalized. For example, in order to receive a pension after 65 years of age, you have to work for at least 5 years, and basically with the law, we have to engage in sex work until 65 years old in order to be able to have a pension. So it's not the same thing. Just because sex work is legalized here doesn't mean everything is great. And we need to fight against the Nordic model, which my fellow speakers here today have been talking about. And we're seeing peaceful demonstrations and protests in order to promote sex workers' rights. And we're supporting ourselves. We've come together in networks to support ourselves. So what happens with that? When at one point, Germany is looking into the Nordic model, where we're really seeing a lot of difficulties, and we're being attacked by feminists, the radical feminists, who are trying to move us backwards. They're trying to go back into the Nordic model and start criminalizing clients. And that would be catastrophic for us here, because if you, since 2002, as before as well, but since 2002, when sex work was legalized, the amount of money that's been invested in clubs, bosses as well, who have invested in sex work venues, the girls who have moved to Germany, have made their lives here, have gone through all the red tape to register. We're really hanging from a thread here, to put it that way. And we're also dealing with that fear of what's going to happen next. We're looking at a second lockdown here, and we're all scared because And they're trying to impose the Nordic model. And what's the solution that they give us to all our problems? They tell us to go to the job center. They look for a job for you. They help you, supposedly to succeed in the German economy. You learn the language, and they give you some financial assistance depending on your monthly income and expenses. So, in other words, it's really zero. It's going all the way back to where we started. We're going backwards. It would be regressive. And so what we're doing in COSMOPOLITRANS is we're continuing to support our colleagues by providing them with basic food products, with hygiene products, and some of our trans colleagues are no longer able to access the brothels to work. And we're all waiting and watching to see what's going to happen next. And there's a great sense of uncertainty. Okay, we're running out of time here. Okay, so last thing, we're waiting to see what's going to happen with the second lockdown. If they're going to leave us without being able to work until March, because they closed everything in November. In December they've extended it. Now it's looking like it's going to be through January. And now we're hearing that in January it's going to be extended until March. So what we're potentially facing is 5 months of complete lockdown, and that would really, really decimate our community. Thank you very much. So we've touched again on the topic of the abolitionists. I just saw two days ago, I just saw an article about this, about how, like, oh, the German model is so great. But yeah, they're not actually looking out for sex workers. They're only thinking about the money. Exactly. And we're really far away from where we need to be. So that was what I thought when I saw this article. That was really kind of praising the German model, because I was thinking, like, yeah, but like we don't like what's going on there, because because for all the reasons that you've explained to us, that it's actually very difficult to comply with the requirements of the system, and it's been really, really difficult. So we also need to keep in mind, and this is perhaps the more that we need to remember to keep in mind and to center the most vulnerable of our communities, and those who are most affected. So we're almost in the second part of our session now. We have all of this rage, this fury that we've expressed, at how shit the situation is, and now, so now we want to kind of reflect on the resistance that we've always had as trans people, as sex workers, as vulnerable communities, marginalized communities, how we're fighting against the oppression of the state. And a lot of times, like Juan was saying, we're actually having to take over the role of the state or of the government to look out for ourselves. So I would like to know what you are doing from your point of view, from the point of view of your organizations, in terms of these connections that we've created between ourselves, the alliances that we've forged during this pandemic, and what is the future of our movement, so to speak. Since we have, in light of the situation with COVID, we'd like to hear a little bit about your perspectives, your takes on this year and the progress that we've made. it looks like Georgina isn't going to be able to connect. So, Linda, if you'd like to speak to us, please. What do you, what's in store for the future? What are you working towards? So, a little bit about what I'm doing, the work that we're doing right now. I'd actually prefer to work to hear from Conxa, for example, because I think you're the ones who are really kind of working on the ground and who are really who are really in the middle of this right now. So I think it would be great to hear from you. But yeah, I don't know if you'd like to add, you know, if you have any comments to make or. Also, honestly, we're facing a difficult situation, and there's a great sense of a really big sense of pessimism, and we're also just tired. We're seeing over and over again how different states, different governments, even the abolitionist organizations, which are receiving so much funding, and meanwhile us and our organizations, we're getting maybe like 5,000 euros here, a few thousand euros there, and that's it. And meanwhile, these abolitionist organizations are receiving huge amounts of funding. So we're really receiving very, very little. And we're a lot of putas here. We're a lot of whores. we need some money, and the more that these issues continue, the more sex workers there will be. This is a reality. When people do not have a place that they can go to work, when they do not have a place to live, they turn to sex work. That's just a reality that we have to accept. And it seems that the authorities refuse to accept this reality. And so we once again have to pay our rents. We have to make sure that we're surviving from month to month. And they're not recognizing our work. It's not necessarily what we'd love to do, but what we need to continue doing is not allowing anyone who has small children. We can't let the authorities take their children from them just because they're engaging in sex work. Because what we can do instead is support them. We need to ensure that none of our colleagues are left without a roof over their head, without knowing where their next meal is going to come from. We need to speak out against this every single day, because we do not want Spain to be abolitionist, or France to be abolitionist, or for Germany to go back to the Nordic model, while we sex workers are dying of hunger. And there are people who do not know what they will be eating for their next meal, and they are begging in the streets because they have nothing. And these are women who are extremely vulnerable, and they are women who are supporting themselves, and they're receiving no other form of support, and a lot of times they're having to care for their children and provide for their children. So what is it that society and the governments really want from sex workers? Because I don't understand what the logic is. Because on the one hand, it's like, oh, what, are we going to let them all die of hunger? And we cannot really look out for sex workers and ensure their rights if sex workers continues being criminalized. I'm going to die fucking, I'm never going to give this up. Because I have to provide for myself. I have to survive. We do not want to stop being whores. And think about, look around, look at all of the sex workers who are dying from hunger. And a lot of the times they have no other choice but to go out and work in the streets. What's going to happen when they're not able to do that? We're not receiving any form of support. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. They are not even providing us with the medical exams that could save us from an infection. Hello, you are denying us bread and salt. If you're saying that, you know, you're looking out for people with this pandemic, it's bullshit, because you're not looking out for sex workers at all, or our basic needs. We're not even getting regular medical care, basic medical care. We for things like chlamydia, which doesn't have any symptoms.
Aquí en España, a nuestro guapísimo presidente, porque mira, todo lo que tiene de guapo lo tiene de imbécil y de gilipollas. Lo voy a decir así, porque un tío que sale, cuando se implementó el sindicato OTRAS, cuando salimos a la luz, cuando nos bautizan y cuando salimos todas orgullosas de haber creado el primer sindicato.
In our unions, the first thing that we saw him say is that sex work is illegal, and it was so crap. It's so horrible to not even feel accepted by your own country. So we are continuing as a collective. Who are we? We're sex workers, and we're sex workers who have not been listened to. They're not answering the phone. They're not responding to our emails. A lot of times we're mocked, we're made fun of. People leave horrible messages saying that they, you know, oh, why don't they should all die already. We are facing so much stigma, and there's such a grave lack of support. It's not enough. But at least we are doing something. Even if we're just providing people with something to eat for the day, at least we are doing something. Why is the government not doing anything? Why are the abolitionist organizations, which are receiving millions of euros in these countries, why are they not doing anything to support us, to help our colleagues who are engaged in sex work? This is what we're facing in Spain at the moment. Should have I run out of time? Yes. Just one tiny thing to add. So, if the brothels are closed and women do not have any other option, what are they supposed to do? Where do they go? To work in the streets? To work in the houses of their friends who might be more privileged and have some nice houses? What are we doing, really? Sometimes I ask myself, because it would be really nice to have enough to get out of the industry and to live nice and comfortably in our houses, but it's really not realistic. So, to sum up, there's a lot of work to be done. And what I'd like to ask from you is exactly this, a lot of unity, a lot of strength, and for us to continue working together. So we have 10 minutes left, but thankfully we have Georgina here with us now. She was able to join, our colleague from Argentina. Welcome, Georgina. We don't have much time left, so you have 10 minutes. And that's what we have. Hi, how is everyone? Great, thank you. We're so happy to have you here.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you. So we're really going through an exhausting period, and Here in Argentina, they're talking about abortion is a big topic at the moment. Can you hear me? Yeah, yeah.
Para nosotras es un contexto favorable para el movimiento.
And so the legalization of abortion has been a good thing for us as sex workers. And however, we're looking here at things about it's really an issue of bodily autonomy, and there's a lot of feminists out there who have this, they uphold this banner of bodily autonomy, but when it comes to sex work, suddenly they have a different opinion. They suddenly, when it comes to autonomy and sovereignty, that belongs to the state, belongs to the government, and they're in favor of criminalizing sex work. And so when we talk about bodily autonomy and agency over our own bodies, and a society that respects our decisions and our agency, and this is especially something that affects the sex worker community and the trans community. And so in this meeting, in this event, for us as sex workers at the international level, the pandemic has been extremely difficult for us, and it continues to be extremely difficult for us. And because not only has it contributed to the precarity and the precariousness of our work, and made it even more difficult for sex workers to work with dignity, and it's worsening social stigma for merely engaging in work that we do not have access to government assistance. And at least here in Argentina, we're not just talking about violations of rights of workers as sex workers. They're also violating our rights as citizens. For example, the right to living arrangements or to accommodation. A lot of times we have to pay twice or 3 times as much rent just because we're sex workers. And there's a lot of abuses against us. And the owners, property owners, or owners of hotels end up charging us a lot more. And we have to pay so much more than everyone else. And in the context of this pandemic, where it's been very difficult for us to work and where we're being isolated and forced into lockdown, access to accommodation has been very difficult. So our collective, which has a emergency fund, they have to they end up in the streets, or they're having to live in much more hostile environments, where they're liable to face a lot more violence, abuse, discrimination. And here we're also talking about not just about the sex work itself, but also just the overall idea of abolitionism in general. And our message is that sex work exists. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. I don't care whether you like it, but it's a thing. It's these are people who are at risk. It's a vulnerable community, a vulnerable population. So the state should be taking more care of us. Abolitionists should have more resentment towards the state that isn't doing enough to provide for us, rather than having so much resentment and hatred towards sex workers. And it's something where, like Juan was saying, we as sex workers are having to support each other and take care of each other, when this is something that should be being done by our government. And honestly, they're not making our lives better. They're not helping us. They're not addressing our needs as sex workers. And we are the ones ending up having to do what the government should be doing, providing basic food supplies, and we as sex workers had to start doing this because the government wasn't. It's something the government should have been doing and needs to be doing. It's their responsibility to guarantee the right to life of women. But the reality is that there's certain women's lives matter to them and others do not. And we have, you know, a lot of times the stereotypical good woman, white, blonde woman is the one who gets the help, and they've gotten fed up of sex workers. And trans sex workers is even worse. And at the international level, we've seen how the majority of sex workers organizations have had to take on much more difficult working hours, and we've had to work really hard to raise funds to be able to support our colleagues, those who need them the most. And these things, there's a limit to this, because honestly, with the demand that's being faced, because sex workers need access to their rights. So, for example, the first week of lockdown here in Argentina was the 15th of March was when it started. And here in the city of Buenos Aires, we had 50 colleagues who needed help from the union. And then by June, we were talking about 700 colleagues. So the number keeps rising. And this is something that the state should be doing. The state is responsible for taking care of people with their basic needs like this. To speak with property holders, to ensure that we don't face violence. And here in Argentina, we see a lot of repression by the police as well. And there's a lot of violence against migrants as well. And Argentina has, supposedly, it has inclusive migrant policies. It's signed different treaties and accords, but there, once again, we're seeing a lot of stigma. Our colleagues who are engaging in a criminalized form of work often face even more problems if they're migrants. Because if it's found out that they're engaging in sex work, a lot of times they're deported. So someone who has who's a migrant is in an even more precarious position. So we're trying to put the focus on fighting for and ensuring our rights as citizens. Sometimes it's very tiring, it's exhausting, and because we're always talking about and arguing about the same things. The issues are always the same, and in the meantime, the reality doesn't change. They're still discriminating against us. We're still facing violence and stigma. And I can't retire. I want to retire in dignity as a sex worker, and there's a lot of I have a lot of colleagues who can't even join in the debate, and because honestly, we need to fight against this trend that's continuing to benefit institutionalized abolitionism. And they're continuing to receive salaries, and they are the ones who are continuing to impose and promote marginalizing policies. We are the last ones who the authorities pay attention to. They don't care about us. They give us the minimum amount of support. And so our colleagues are really in extremely vulnerable situations. And when it comes to public policy, in fact, at one point we said we had to do all this work as a union, and we could not rely on the government for support. And you know what we're fighting for is, you know, we don't want the police to stigmatize us. We don't want them to criminalize us. They don't want us to repress us. And I think that being able to support our colleagues is one of the good things that we've achieved during this pandemic. So what's been saving us is the solidarity that we have between us, the mutual support that we work towards. We need public policies that provide us with basic food supplies, also policies that ensure our access to accommodation and housing, and we need to be able to cope with these lockdown measures. If we're not able to work, they need to pay us, and if not, we're going to end up in the streets. And we're going to end up working in the streets, and they need to help us in being able to secure housing. And how can we translate this experience that we've been facing during the pandemic into productive public policies, into policies that ensure that everyone always has a meal and food to eat? Thank you, Georgina. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. You always have so many interesting things to say. And it's true, you've said something very true, that sex workers do not need abolitionists, but abolitionists need sex workers. So we're honestly useful for them at the moment. And they're using us as tools, as pawns in their public policies. And it's a really pressing situation here in Barcelona. For example, we have a center that looks really nice and it's all fancy, but it's actually when you look 5 floors up, there's people who are on the brink of dying. Unfortunately, our time is up today. This has been a round table, a very pissed off round table, a very sex worker round table as well. So thank you so much for all of the amazing work that you're all carrying out. I hope that you've been enjoying the streaming as well, and that you've taken something away from all of the things that our sex worker colleagues have shared with us, especially Latinx sex workers who are working in Europe. And as our colleagues said, let's hope that next year we will not have to have the 17th of December anymore. So thank you so much for everyone. This is the end of the session for the ICRC Digital Festival, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Putas.
Fuerza.
Thank you.
Fuerza putas, vamos.
Putas, beso.
Beso, compañera.